There's a photograph sitting in the archives of the Chicago Historical Society that no curator wants to discuss. Taken during a formal dinner party in 1902, it shows 12 well-dressed guests seated around an elegant dining table, smiling for the camera. But if you look closely at the 13th chair, the empty one at the head of the table, you'll notice something that shouldn't be there. Something that has made seasoned historians refuse to work alone in the archives after dark. This is the story of the Ashford dinner photograph, and the discovery that turned a simple family portrait into one of the most disturbing images in American photographic history, because sometimes the most terrifying things aren't what we can see clearly, but what we almost see, lurking just at the edge of perception. Our story begins in the summer of 2023, when digital restoration specialist Dr. Michael Harrison was contracted by the Chicago Historical Society to enhance and preserve a collection of early 20th century photographs. Dr. Harrison was renowned for his ability to bring clarity to damaged historical images, using cutting-edge technology to reveal details that had been hidden for decades. Dr. Harrison had spent 15 years perfecting digital restoration techniques that could extract information from photographs that appeared to be beyond saving. His work had helped solve historical mysteries, identify unknown individuals in family portraits, and preserve cultural heritage that might otherwise have been lost forever. His reputation in the field had been built on a combination of technical expertise and an almost intuitive understanding of photographic processes. Dr. Harrison could look at a damaged photograph and immediately understand what techniques would be most effective in revealing hidden details. The techniques he had pioneered involved using multiple scanning methods and advanced computer algorithms to enhance and clarify historical images. His software could analyze the chemical composition of photographic emulsions, compensate for age-related deterioration, and even reconstruct missing portions of images based on mathematical models. Dr. Harrison's laboratory was equipped with state-of-the-art scanning equipment that could capture images at resolutions far exceeding what was possible with conventional photography. His custom-built scanners used multiple light sources and specialized filters to reveal details that were invisible to the naked eye. The process of digital restoration required not only technical skill, but also extensive knowledge of historical photographic techniques. Dr. Harrison had studied the methods used by photographers throughout history, understanding how different chemicals, papers, and processes affected the final images. Dr. Harrison's work had been featured in numerous academic journals and had contributed to important historical research projects around the world. Museums and archives regularly sought his expertise when dealing with their most challenging preservation cases. His most famous previous case had involved enhancing a Civil War photograph that had revealed the presence of a previously unknown regiment, leading to the discovery of military records that had been lost for over a century. That success had established his reputation as someone who could find the impossible in historical images. The Chicago Historical Society had acquired a significant collection of photographs from the estate of the Ashford family, one of Chicago's most prominent industrial dynasties, during the late 1800s and early 1900s. The collection included formal portraits, family gatherings, and documentation of the family's extensive business and social activities. The Ashford family had made their fortune in steel manufacturing and railroad construction, becoming one of the wealthiest families in Chicago during the city's rapid expansion following the Great Fire of 1871. They had been instrumental in rebuilding the city and had established several charitable foundations that continued to operate well into the modern era. Theodore Ashford, the family patriarch, had arrived in Chicago in 1875 with little more than ambition and a basic understanding of metallurgy. Through a combination of shrewd business practices, strategic partnerships, and what some called ruthless determination, he had built an industrial empire that employed thousands of workers and generated enormous profits. Theodore's rise to power had been meteoric, fueled by the city's desperate need for steel and construction materials following the devastating fire. He had secured crucial contracts for rebuilding projects and had expanded his operations rapidly to meet the enormous demand. The Ashford Steel Works had become one of the largest steel producers in the Midwest, supplying materials for the construction of skyscrapers, bridges, and railroad infrastructure throughout the region. The company's success had made Theodore one of the most powerful men in Chicago, with influence that extended into politics, finance, and social circles. Theodore had been known for his demanding personality and his expectation of absolute loyalty from his employees and business partners. He had built his empire through a combination of innovation, hard work, and what many considered to be ruthless business practices that eliminated competition and maximized profits. Dr. Harrison had been working through the collection systematically, scanning and enhancing each photograph to create a comprehensive digital archive. Most of the images were typical of their era: formal family portraits, documentation of social events, and business-related photographs showing the family's various enterprises. The business records alone represented a treasure trove of information about Chicago's industrial development, documenting the relationships between major companies, the evolution of manufacturing techniques, and the social dynamics of the city's business elite. The family photographs provided insight into the domestic life of one of Chicago's most prominent families, showing how the wealthy lived during the Gilded Age and documenting the elaborate social rituals that defined high society during that era. The collection also included photographs of the family's various properties, including their mansion on Prairie Avenue, their summer estate in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, and their business facilities throughout the Chicago area. These images provided a comprehensive visual record of the family's wealth and influence. The photograph that would change everything was labeled simply Ashford Family Dinner, December 15, 1902. It had been taken in the grand dining room of the Ashford Mansion on Prairie Avenue during what appeared to be a formal dinner party celebrating the family patriarch's birthday. Prairie Avenue had been known as Millionaire's Row during the late 1800s and early 1900s, home to Chicago's wealthiest families, including the Armours, the Fields, and the Pullmans. The Ashford Mansion had been one of the most impressive residences on the street, a massive Victorian structure with elaborate architectural details and luxurious interior appointments. The mansion had been designed by one of Chicago's most prominent architects and had featured the latest in modern conveniences, including electric lighting, central heating, and indoor plumbing. The interior had been decorated with furnishings and artwork imported from Europe, creating an atmosphere of refined elegance. The image showed 12 people seated around an ornate mahogany dining table, dressed in the formal evening wear that was customary for such occasions during the Edwardian era. The dining room was elegantly appointed, with crystal chandeliers, fine china, and elaborate floral arrangements that spoke to the family's wealth and social status. The table setting was magnificent, featuring Baccarat crystal, Limoges porcelain, and sterling silver flatware that had been crafted by the finest artisans of the era. The floral arrangements included exotic blooms that had been imported from Europe specifically for the occasion, demonstrating the family's ability to acquire luxury items regardless of cost. The guests were dressed in the height of fashion for 1902, with the women wearing elaborate gowns with intricate beadwork, and the men in formal evening wear with white bow ties and tailcoats. The clothing and jewelry visible in the photograph represented a fortune in itself, showcasing the extreme wealth of Chicago's social elite. At first glance, the photograph appeared to be a typical example of formal family photography from the early 1900s. The composition was carefully arranged, with family members positioned to create a pleasing visual balance. The lighting was expertly managed, creating depth and dimension that brought the subjects to life. The photographer had clearly been skilled in the complex techniques required for indoor photography during that era, when artificial lighting was limited and exposure times were lengthy. The fact that all 12 people appeared sharp and well-focused indicated that the session had been carefully planned and executed. The technical quality of the photograph was exceptional for its time, demonstrating the photographer's mastery of the challenging conditions involved in indoor portrait photography. The exposure was perfectly balanced, capturing detail in both the bright areas illuminated by the chandeliers and the darker corners of the room. But as Dr. Harrison began the digital enhancement process, he noticed something unusual about the photograph. At the head of the table sat an ornate chair that appeared to be empty, yet there was something about the shadows and lighting around that chair that didn't seem quite right. The chair itself was a magnificent piece of furniture, carved from mahogany and upholstered in rich burgundy velvet. It was clearly the seat of honor at the table, positioned to command a view of all the other guests and decorated with the family crest embroidered in gold thread. The positioning of the chair was significant in the context of Victorian and Edwardian dining customs, where the head of the table was always reserved for the most important person present. The fact that this chair had been left empty suggested that it was being held in honor of someone who was absent. Dr. Harrison applied various digital filters and enhancement techniques to bring out details that might not be visible in the original photograph. As he adjusted the contrast and brightness levels, he began to see what appeared to be a faint outline in the empty chair. At first, he assumed it was a photographic artifact, or perhaps a reflection from one of the crystal glasses on the table, but as he continued to enhance the image, the outline became more distinct, revealing what appeared to be the silhouette of a person sitting in the chair. The enhancement process involved multiple iterations, with Dr. Harrison applying different algorithms and filters to isolate specific elements of the image. Each enhancement revealed additional details, building a clearer picture of what the camera had captured on that December evening in 1902. Dr. Harrison's enhancement software was capable of analyzing the photograph at the molecular level, examining the distribution of silver particles in the photographic emulsion to reconstruct details that had been too faint to be visible in the original image. Dr. Harrison had encountered similar phenomena before in historical photographs, usually caused by double exposures or long exposure times that could capture the movement of people during the photography session. But this image was different. The silhouette was too clear and too well defined to be explained by conventional photographic anomalies. The positioning of the silhouette was also unusual. Most photographic artifacts appeared as overlapping images or blurred outlines that clearly indicated movement or technical errors. But this silhouette appeared to be sitting still, positioned naturally in the chair as if it belonged there. The clarity and definition of the silhouette suggested that whatever had created it had been stationary during the exposure, ruling out the possibility of movement blur or accidental double exposure. The figure appeared to be as solid and well-defined as the other people in the photograph. Using advanced digital restoration software, Dr. Harrison was able to isolate and enhance the mysterious silhouette. What he discovered made him question everything he thought he knew about the photograph and the family it depicted. The silhouette showed a figure that appeared to be wearing formal evening attire, consistent with the period, but there was something deeply unsettling about the posture and positioning of the figure. It seemed to be leaning forward slightly, as if listening intently to the conversation around the table, yet none of the other family members appeared to be acknowledging its presence. The clothing details that Dr. Harrison could discern suggested a man wearing a formal dinner jacket with a white shirt and bow tie, exactly the type of attire that would have been appropriate for such an occasion. The figure appeared to be holding something in its hands, possibly a wine glass or piece of silverware. The posture of the figure was particularly intriguing, as it suggested someone who was actively participating in the dinner conversation, despite being invisible to the other guests. The slight forward lean indicated attention and engagement, as if the figure was listening carefully to what was being said. Most disturbing was the way the other family members were positioned in relation to the empty chair. While they appeared to be engaged in conversation and enjoying their meal, there was a subtle tension in their postures that suggested they were aware of something unusual, even if they weren't directly acknowledging it. Several of the family members appeared to be avoiding looking directly at the empty chair, while others seemed to be glancing toward it nervously. The overall body language of the group suggested an underlying discomfort that contrasted with the formal pleasantries of the occasion. Dr. Harrison cross-referenced the photograph with the Ashford family records to determine who should have been seated in that chair. According to the family documents, the chair at the head of the table was traditionally reserved for the family patriarch, Theodore Ashford, who had founded the family's business empire. But Theodore Ashford had died 3 months before the photograph was taken. Dr. Harrison initially assumed there had been an error in the dating of the photograph, but further research confirmed that the image had indeed been taken on December 15, 1902, during a dinner party held to commemorate what would have been Theodore's 70th birthday. The family records included detailed documentation of the event, including guest lists, menu cards, and correspondence related to the planning of the dinner party. Everything confirmed that the photograph had been taken exactly when the label indicated, 3 months after Theodore's death. The guest list for the dinner party included prominent members of Chicago society, business associates of the Ashford family, and close personal friends who had known Theodore for many years. The event had been planned as both a memorial to Theodore and a demonstration that the family was continuing to function despite their loss. The family had apparently decided to proceed with the celebration despite Theodore's death, setting his place at the table and leaving his chair empty as a tribute to his memory. This practice was not uncommon during the Victorian and Edwardian eras, when elaborate mourning rituals were an important part of social customs. Victorian mourning practices often included maintaining the deceased person's place at family gatherings, keeping their belongings exactly as they had left them, and continuing to include them in family traditions and celebrations. The Ashford family's decision to hold Theodore's birthday dinner despite his death would have been seen as a touching tribute to his memory. The menu for the dinner party had been elaborate, featuring multiple courses of the finest foods available, including imported delicacies and wines from Theodore's personal collection. The family had spared no expense in creating a celebration worthy of Theodore's memory and status, but the presence of the mysterious silhouette suggested that something more than a simple memorial dinner had taken place that evening. Dr. Harrison decided to research the circumstances surrounding Theodore Ashford's death to see if there might be any explanation for the unusual photographic phenomenon. What he discovered was a story that had been carefully concealed by the family for more than a century. Theodore Ashford had not died of natural causes, as the official records indicated. According to private family correspondence that Dr. Harrison found in the Historical Society's archives, Theodore had taken his own life, following a series of business failures and personal scandals that had threatened to destroy the family's reputation. The steel industry had been experiencing significant upheaval in 1902, with new competitors and changing market conditions putting pressure on established companies like the Ashford Steel Works. Theodore had made several risky investments in an attempt to maintain the company's market position, but these ventures had failed catastrophically. The financial losses had been staggering, threatening not only the family's wealth, but also the jobs of thousands of workers who depended on the steel mills for their livelihoods. Theodore had borrowed heavily to finance his failed ventures, putting the entire business empire at risk of bankruptcy. The business failures had been particularly devastating because they had come at a time when the steel industry was experiencing rapid growth and expansion. Theodore's inability to capitalize on these opportunities had been seen as a personal failure that reflected poorly on his business acumen. More damaging than the financial losses were the personal scandals that had begun to surface in the months before Theodore's death. There were allegations of corruption in his business dealings, questions about his treatment of workers at the steel mills, and rumors of inappropriate relationships that had shocked Chicago's high society. The corruption allegations were particularly serious, involving claims that Theodore had bribed city officials to overlook safety violations at his factories, paid judges to rule in his favor in labor disputes, and used intimidation tactics against workers who attempted to organize unions. The scandal had been brewing for months before it became public, with investigators quietly gathering evidence of Theodore's illegal activities. The family had been aware that serious charges were likely to be filed, and they had been preparing for the possibility of criminal prosecution. The family had worked desperately to suppress these stories, using their wealth and influence to keep the most damaging information out of the newspapers. But Theodore had become increasingly despondent as the pressure mounted, and he had begun to withdraw from public life. According to a letter written by Theodore's wife, Margaret Ashford, Theodore had become convinced that he was being watched and followed in the weeks before his death. He had spoken of seeing figures in mirrors and shadows that seemed to move independently of any light source. Theodore has become increasingly agitated and fearful, Margaret had written to her sister in Boston. He claims that he is being haunted by the spirits of those he has wronged, and that they are demanding justice for his crimes. I fear that his guilt has driven him to madness. The letter went on to describe Theodore's final days, during which he had refused to eat, and had spent hours staring at empty chairs and corners of rooms, as if he could see something that others could not perceive. Margaret's correspondence painted a picture of a man consumed by guilt and paranoia, convinced that supernatural forces were pursuing him for the wrongs he had committed during his rise to power. She described finding him talking to empty rooms, apologizing to people who weren't there, and begging for forgiveness from invisible accusers. Theodore's behavior had become so erratic that the family had considered having him committed to a private sanitarium, but they had been afraid that such an action would only fuel more speculation about his mental state and the scandals surrounding his business dealings. On September 12, 1902, Theodore Ashford was found dead in his study, having apparently taken poison. The family physician had been persuaded to list the cause of death as heart failure, and the true circumstances of Theodore's death had been kept secret. The cover-up had been extensive, involving not only the family physician, but also the coroner, the police, and several newspaper editors who had been paid to suppress the story. The official cause of death was listed as sudden cardiac failure, and Theodore was given a lavish funeral that was attended by Chicago's social and business elite. The funeral had been a carefully orchestrated event, designed to maintain the fiction that Theodore had died of natural causes and to demonstrate the family's continued standing in Chicago society. The elaborate ceremony had cost a fortune and had been attended by hundreds of mourners. Dr. Harrison realized that the dinner party photographed on December 15, 1902, had been more than just a memorial celebration. It had been an attempt by the family to demonstrate that they were moving forward despite the tragedy, and to maintain the fiction that Theodore had died of natural causes. But the mysterious silhouette in the photograph suggested that Theodore's presence had somehow persisted beyond his death. Dr. Harrison decided to examine other photographs from the Ashford collection to see if similar anomalies appeared in any other images. He found several photographs taken in the months following Theodore's death that showed unexplained shadows and silhouettes in locations where Theodore had frequently spent time. In a photograph of the family library taken in January 1903, there was a faint outline of a figure standing near Theodore's favorite reading chair. The library had been Theodore's private sanctuary, where he had conducted business meetings and spent hours reading financial reports and technical journals. The library photograph showed the same characteristics as the dinner party image, a clear silhouette that appeared to be wearing period-appropriate clothing and positioned naturally within the room. The figure seemed to be reaching for a book on one of the shelves, as if continuing the activities that Theodore had enjoyed in life. In a portrait of Margaret Ashford taken in the garden, there appeared to be a shadow behind her that didn't correspond to any visible object or person. Margaret's expression in the photograph was tense and worried, suggesting that she might have been aware of the presence that the camera had captured. The garden photograph was particularly disturbing because it suggested that Theodore's presence was not confined to the interior of the house, but extended to the outdoor spaces where the family spent time. Margaret appeared to be looking over her shoulder, as if she sensed that she was being watched. Most disturbing was a photograph taken during a business meeting at the Ashford Steelworks in March 1903. The image showed several men gathered around a conference table, but there was a clear silhouette of an additional figure seated at the head of the table, the position that Theodore had always occupied during such meetings. The business meeting photograph was particularly significant because it suggested that Theodore's presence was not limited to the family home, but extended to his business operations as well. The men in the photograph appeared uncomfortable and distracted, as if they were aware of something unusual happening during the meeting. The conference room where the photograph was taken had been the site of many important business decisions during Theodore's lifetime, and it appeared that his spirit was continuing to manifest in the location where he had exercised the most power and control. Dr. Harrison began to suspect that the Ashford family had been experiencing supernatural phenomena in the months following Theodore's death, and that these experiences had been inadvertently captured in their photographs. The pattern of appearances suggested that Theodore's spirit was particularly drawn to locations and situations where he had exercised power and control during his lifetime. The dining room, the library, and the business conference room had all been places where Theodore had made important decisions and wielded influence over others. The consistency of the manifestations across multiple photographs and locations suggested that the family was dealing with a persistent and powerful supernatural presence that was not confined to any single location or time. Dr. Harrison decided to research the history of the Ashford mansion to see if there had been any reports of unusual activity following Theodore's death. He found newspaper accounts from 1903 and 1904 that described strange occurrences in the Prairie Avenue neighborhood where the mansion was located. Neighbors had reported seeing lights in the mansion's windows late at night, even when the family was known to be traveling. There had been accounts of mysterious sounds coming from the property, including what sounded like furniture being moved and doors slamming when no one was present. The sounds were often described as occurring in patterns that suggested someone was pacing through the rooms or moving objects around, as if searching for something or trying to restore order to a disrupted environment. The neighbors' reports were particularly credible because they came from multiple independent sources and were consistent in their descriptions of the phenomena. The fact that people who had no connection to the Ashford family were experiencing these disturbances suggested that the supernatural activity was genuine and not simply the product of grief or imagination. Most significantly, several visitors to the mansion had reported feeling an oppressive presence in certain rooms, particularly Theodore's former study and the formal dining room where the 1902 photograph had been taken. Dr. Harrison found a particularly intriguing account in a letter written by Dr. James Patterson, a family friend and physician who had attended the December 1902 dinner party. Dr. Patterson had written to a colleague about his experiences that evening, describing sensations that he couldn't explain scientifically. "Throughout the dinner, I had the distinct impression that we were not alone," Dr. Patterson had written. "There was a sense of presence at the head of the table that was so strong it was almost tangible. Several of the other guests commented on feeling watched, and Mrs. Ashford appeared to be quite distressed, though she attempted to maintain her composure." Dr. Patterson had also noted that the temperature in the dining room had seemed unusually cold, despite the fact that the fireplace was burning and the room should have been comfortably warm. Most peculiar of all, Dr. Patterson had continued, was the behavior of the family dog, a normally well-behaved spaniel that had been Theodore's constant companion. The animal refused to enter the dining room and spent the entire evening whimpering and pacing in the hallway, as if it could sense something that the rest of us could not perceive. The dog's behavior was particularly significant because animals were often believed to be more sensitive to supernatural phenomena than humans. The fact that Theodore's own pet had been frightened by something in the dining room suggested that whatever presence was there was malevolent or disturbing in nature. Dr. Patterson's account also mentioned that several of the dinner guests had complained of feeling nauseated or dizzy during the meal, despite the fact that the food and wine were of the highest quality. These physical symptoms were consistent with reports of supernatural encounters from other documented cases. Dr. Harrison realized that the photograph had captured more than just a family gathering. It had documented a supernatural encounter that the family had been reluctant to acknowledge or discuss. Dr. Harrison decided to contact other experts in historical photography and paranormal research to get their opinions on the mysterious silhouette. He reached out to Dr. Elizabeth Crane, a professor of photography history at Northwestern University, and Dr. Robert Sterling, a parapsychologist who specialized in photographic evidence of supernatural phenomena. Dr. Crane was considered one of the leading experts on early 20th century photography techniques, with particular expertise in the technical challenges of indoor photography during that era. She had written extensively about the equipment and methods used by professional photographers in the early 1900s. Her expertise extended beyond technical matters to include the social and cultural context of photography during the period, understanding how photographic sessions were conducted and what factors might have influenced the final images. Dr. Crane examined the enhanced images and confirmed that the silhouette was not the result of conventional photographic techniques or errors. The positioning and clarity of the figure suggested that it had been present during the actual photography session, rather than being added later through double exposure or other manipulation. "The technical aspects of this image are fascinating," Dr. Crane explained. "The silhouette shows proper perspective and lighting that would be consistent with an actual person sitting in that chair. If this is a hoax, it's an extraordinarily sophisticated one that would have required advanced knowledge of photographic techniques that weren't widely available in 1902. Dr. Crane also noted that the photographic equipment used in 1902 would have made it extremely difficult to create convincing double exposures or other manipulated images. The cameras of that era used large glass plate negatives that were processed individually, making it nearly impossible to combine multiple images without obvious signs of manipulation. The chemistry and physics of early photography actually make this image more credible, not less," Dr. Crane continued. The photographic processes of 1902 were much more straightforward than modern techniques, and there were fewer opportunities for accidental or intentional manipulation. The glass plate negatives used in 1902 were also much more sensitive to certain types of energy than modern photographic materials, which might explain how the camera was able to capture something that was invisible to the human eye. Dr. Sterling's assessment was even more intriguing. He had studied hundreds of allegedly supernatural photographs and had developed techniques for distinguishing genuine anomalies from hoaxes or natural phenomena. "This image shows characteristics that I've observed in other cases of apparent spirit photography," Dr. Sterling said. "The partial transparency of the figure, the way it seems to interact with the lighting in the room, and the fact that it appears to be wearing period-appropriate clothing all suggest that we're dealing with a genuine paranormal phenomenon." Dr. Sterling had developed a classification system for supernatural photographs based on the technical characteristics of the anomalies they contained. The Ashford photograph fit the profile of what he called Class A spirit photography, images that showed clear, detailed apparitions that appeared to be interacting with their environment in realistic ways. Class A spirit photographs are extremely rare, Dr. Sterling explained. Most alleged supernatural images fall into lower categories that can be explained by conventional photographic phenomena or deliberate manipulation. But this image shows characteristics that are consistent with genuine paranormal activity. Dr. Sterling also noted that the positioning of the silhouette was significant from a psychological perspective. The figure appears to be leaning forward, as if trying to participate in the conversation or make its presence known. This is consistent with reports of spirits who have unfinished business or who are reluctant to accept their death. The expert analysis confirmed that the photograph contained genuine anomalies that couldn't be explained by conventional photographic techniques or natural phenomena. This gave Dr. Harrison confidence to pursue his investigation into the Ashford family's history and the circumstances surrounding Theodore's death. Armed with expert confirmation that the photograph contained genuine anomalies, Dr. Harrison decided to delve deeper into the Ashford family history to understand why Theodore's spirit might have remained earthbound. Dr. Harrison's research led him to discover a pattern of suspicious deaths and unexplained accidents associated with the Ashford business empire. Workers at the steel mills had died in industrial accidents at rates that were unusually high, even for the dangerous working conditions of the early 1900s. The steel industry during that era was notoriously dangerous, with workers facing risks from molten metal, heavy machinery, and toxic fumes. But the accident rates at Ashford facilities were significantly higher than industry averages, suggesting that safety precautions were inadequate or that workers were being forced to take unnecessary risks. The working conditions at the Ashford steelworks were particularly harsh, with employees required to work 12-hour shifts in extreme heat and dangerous environments. The company's emphasis on maximizing production often came at the expense of worker safety, leading to preventable accidents and injuries. More troubling were the reports of workers who had attempted to organize labor unions or protest unsafe working conditions. Several of these individuals had died under mysterious circumstances, including accidents that seemed to occur at suspiciously convenient times for the Ashford family's business interests. Dr. Harrison found records of at least 12 workers who had died in accidents at Ashford facilities between 1895 and 1902, many of them just days or weeks after filing complaints about working conditions or attempting to organize their fellow workers. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidental. Workers who challenged Theodore's authority or threatened his profits seemed to experience fatal accidents at an alarming rate, while those who remained quiet and compliant were generally safe. One particularly disturbing case involved a worker named Patrick O'Brien, who had been organizing a strike to protest the 12-hour work shifts that were standard at the steel mills. O'Brien had been found dead in a vat of molten steel, apparently having fallen from a catwalk while inspecting equipment. But witnesses had reported that O'Brien was an experienced worker who was always careful around dangerous equipment, and that he had been threatened by supervisors just days before his death. The official investigation had concluded that the death was accidental, but O'Brien's family had suspected foul play. Another case involved a worker named Giuseppe Marconi, who had been attempting to organize Italian immigrants who worked at the steel mills. Marconi had been crushed by a load of steel beams that had apparently shifted during transport, but several witnesses claimed that the load had been deliberately released. The pattern suggested that Theodore Ashford had been involved in activities that went far beyond normal business practices, and that he might have been responsible for the deaths of workers who had threatened his profits or reputation. Dr. Harrison also discovered evidence that Theodore had been involved in corrupt political dealings, bribing city officials to overlook safety violations and labor law infractions. The scope of his corruption had been extensive, involving judges, police officials, and city council members who had been paid to protect Ashford's interests. The corruption network had allowed Theodore to operate his factories with minimal oversight, ignoring safety regulations and labor laws that might have protected his workers. The bribes had also ensured that investigations into worker deaths were superficial and that no one was ever held accountable for the dangerous conditions at the steel mills. The evidence of Theodore's crimes was extensive and well documented, but it had been carefully concealed by the family and their allies in the political and business establishment. The cover-up had been so effective that the true extent of Theodore's wrongdoing had remained hidden for more than a century. The weight of these crimes might have been what drove Theodore to take his own life, but it also provided a possible explanation for why his spirit had remained earthbound. According to many spiritual traditions, souls who die with unresolved guilt or who have committed serious wrongs against others may be unable to find peace in death. Dr. Harrison decided to research what had happened to the Ashford family in the years following Theodore's death to see if the supernatural phenomena had continued or if the family had found ways to address the haunting. The family's fortunes had declined rapidly after Theodore's death. The steel business had continued to struggle, and several major contracts had been lost to competitors. By 1910, the Ashford Steel Works had been sold to a larger corporation, and the family had lost much of their wealth and social standing. The decline had been precipitous, with the family going from being one of Chicago's wealthiest to facing financial difficulties within just a few years. The loss of Theodore's business acumen and connections had left the family unable to maintain their industrial empire. The business failures had been compounded by the family's inability to adapt to changing market conditions and new technologies. Without Theodore's leadership and vision, the company had fallen behind its competitors and had lost its position as a leader in the steel industry. More significantly, the family had experienced a series of tragedies and misfortunes that seemed to echo the pattern of deaths that had occurred at Theodore's factories. Margaret Ashford had died in 1905 under mysterious circumstances, found at the bottom of the mansion's main staircase with injuries that suggested she had fallen, though there were no witnesses to the accident. The circumstances of Margaret's death were particularly suspicious because she had been in good health and was familiar with the layout of her own home. The staircase where she was found was one that she had used daily for years, making it unlikely that she would have simply lost her footing. The investigation into Margaret's death had been cursory, with the police accepting the family's explanation that she had suffered a dizzy spell and had fallen down the stairs, but servants in the house had reported hearing sounds of a struggle before Margaret's body was discovered. Theodore's eldest son, William, had died in a hunting accident in 1907, shot by his own rifle in circumstances that investigators had been unable to explain. His younger son, Charles, had disappeared while traveling in Europe in 1909, and his body had never been found. William's death had been particularly puzzling because he was an experienced hunter who was known for his careful handling of firearms. The rifle that killed him had discharged while he was climbing over a fence, but the safety mechanisms should have prevented such an accident. The hunting accident had occurred on the family's estate in Wisconsin, where William had been hunting alone despite the family's usual practice of hunting in groups. His body had been found by a groundskeeper several hours after the accident, and there had been no witnesses to explain what had happened. Charles's disappearance in Europe had occurred during what was supposed to be a routine business trip to establish new trading relationships. He had been staying at a reputable hotel in London and had been in regular contact with his family until he suddenly vanished without a trace. The investigation into Charles's disappearance had involved both British and American authorities, but no evidence had ever been found to explain what had happened to him. His hotel room had been found undisturbed, with his belongings still in place, suggesting that he had left voluntarily or had been taken against his will. By 1912, the only surviving member of the immediate family was Theodore's daughter, Eleanor, who had married and moved to California in an apparent attempt to escape the tragedies that had befallen her family. Eleanor's decision to leave Chicago had been sudden and dramatic, with family friends reporting that she had seemed desperate to get as far away from the family home as possible. She had sold most of her possessions and had refused to take any family heirlooms with her to California. The move to California had been seen by many as an admission that Eleanor believed the family was cursed or that there was something dangerous about remaining in Chicago. Her departure had marked the effective end of the Ashford family's presence in the city. Dr. Harrison found letters that Eleanor had written to friends in Chicago, describing her relief at leaving the family mansion and her conviction that the house was cursed. She had refused to return to Chicago even for family funerals, and she had instructed her lawyers to sell the mansion and donate the proceeds to charity. "I cannot bear to set foot in that house again," Eleanor had written in 1913. "There is something evil there, something that feeds on guilt and sorrow. Father's spirit is trapped there, and it will not rest until justice is done for all those he wronged." Eleanor's letters provided the first direct acknowledgement from a family member that they believed Theodore's spirit was haunting the mansion. Her description of the presence as evil and feeding on guilt and sorrow suggested that the supernatural phenomena were malevolent in nature. The letters also revealed that Eleanor had consulted with several spiritualists and mediums in an attempt to understand what was happening to her family. These consultations had apparently confirmed her belief that Theodore's spirit was responsible for the tragedies that had befallen the family. The mansion had been sold in 1914 and had subsequently served as a boarding house, a private school, and eventually a nursing home before being demolished in 1967. But according to records that Dr. Harrison found, every institution that had occupied the building had experienced unusual problems. The boarding house had closed after only 2 years due to complaints from residents about strange noises and unexplained phenomena. Tenants had reported hearing footsteps in empty rooms, doors that opened and closed on their own, and the sensation of being watched by an invisible presence. The private school had relocated after several teachers had reported feeling watched and threatened while working alone in the building. Students had complained about cold spots in certain classrooms and had refused to enter the room that had once been Theodore's study. The nursing home had experienced an unusually high number of unexplained deaths among residents, with many patients reporting visits from a man in formal evening wear who would sit beside their beds and speak to them about guilt and punishment. Dr. Harrison realized that Theodore Ashford's spirit had continued to manifest in the mansion for decades after his death, and that the 1902 dinner photograph was just one piece of evidence documenting a haunting that had persisted for more than 60 years. The pattern of manifestations suggested that Theodore's spirit had become increasingly malevolent over time, moving from simply appearing at family gatherings to actively threatening and harming the living. This progression was consistent with theories about how unresolved guilt and anger could corrupt a spirit over time. Dr. Harrison decided to investigate whether there were any surviving descendants of the Ashford family who might have knowledge of the supernatural phenomena or family stories that had been passed down through generations. His research led him to Eleanor's granddaughter, Patricia Ashford Williams, who lived in San Francisco and worked as a genealogist specializing in family history research. Patricia had been researching her own family's past and had uncovered many of the same disturbing details about Theodore Ashford's business practices. Patricia had spent years trying to understand her family's history, driven by stories that her grandmother Eleanor had told her about the strange events that had occurred in the Chicago mansion. She had become convinced that her family had been involved in serious wrongdoing, but she had struggled to find concrete evidence. The research had been emotionally difficult for Patricia, as she had gradually uncovered evidence of her great-grandfather's crimes and the suffering that he had caused. The discovery that her family's wealth had been built on the exploitation and murder of innocent workers had been devastating. When Dr. Harrison contacted Patricia and showed her the enhanced photograph, her reaction was immediate and emotional. "I've been waiting for someone to find that," Patricia said. "My grandmother told me stories about that dinner party and about the things that happened in the mansion after my great-grandfather's death. She said that the family had tried to pretend everything was normal, but that they all knew he was still there." Patricia explained that Eleanor had shared family stories with her before her death in 1987, including detailed accounts of the supernatural phenomena that had plagued the Ashford family for years after Theodore's death. Grandmother said that Theodore's spirit was angry and restless because he knew that his crimes would eventually be discovered, Patricia continued. She believed that he was trying to prevent the family from moving on because he was afraid of facing judgment for what he had done. Eleanor's stories had painted a picture of a family living in constant fear, never knowing when Theodore's spirit might manifest or what form his anger might take. The supernatural phenomena had affected every aspect of their daily lives, making it impossible for them to find peace or happiness. The stories had been passed down through the family as a kind of oral history, with each generation learning about the dark secrets that had shaped their past. Patricia had grown up knowing that her family had been involved in terrible wrongdoing, but she had never had concrete evidence until now. Patricia also revealed that Eleanor had kept a private journal documenting the supernatural experiences that the family had endured. The journal had been passed down to Patricia, and it contained detailed accounts of apparitions, unexplained sounds, and other phenomena that had occurred in the mansion. The journal represented a unique first-hand account of a prolonged haunting, written by someone who had lived through the experiences and had no reason to fabricate or exaggerate the events she described. Dr. Harrison asked to examine Eleanor's journal, and Patricia agreed to share copies of the relevant entries. What he read provided a chilling first-hand account of a family living with a malevolent supernatural presence. Eleanor's journal entries from 1902 and 1903 described a household in constant fear. Family members had reported seeing Theodore's figure in mirrors and reflective surfaces, always watching but never speaking. Servants had quit without notice, claiming that they felt threatened by an invisible presence that seemed to follow them through the house. The servants' reactions were particularly significant because they had no emotional investment in the family's guilt or trauma. Their fear of the supernatural presence suggested that the phenomena were genuine and not simply the product of grief or imagination. The journal entries described a pattern of escalating supernatural activity, with Theodore's manifestations becoming more frequent and more threatening over time. What had begun as simple appearances in mirrors and photographs had evolved into physical manifestations that could affect the environment and harm the living. Most disturbing were Eleanor's accounts of the dinner party that had been photographed on December 15, 1902. According to her journal, the family had felt Theodore's presence throughout the meal, and several guests had commented on the oppressive atmosphere in the dining room. "Father was there," Eleanor had written. "We all knew it, though none of us dared to speak of it. He sat in his chair as he always had, watching us, judging us. I could feel his anger and his desperation, and I knew that he would never leave us in peace." Eleanor's description of the dinner party matched the evidence that Dr. Harrison had found in the photograph. The family's awareness of Theodore's presence explained the subtle tension that he had observed in their postures and expressions. The journal entry also described the physical effects of Theodore's presence during the dinner party, including the drop in temperature that Dr. Patterson had noted in his letter and the strange behavior of the family dog. Eleanor had also written about the photographer who had taken the dinner party portrait. According to her account, the man had become increasingly agitated during the session, claiming that his equipment was malfunctioning and that he was having difficulty getting proper exposures. The photographer seemed frightened, Eleanor had noted. He kept looking toward Father's empty chair, and at one point he asked if someone was sitting there. When we told him the chair was empty, he became very pale and said that he could see a shadow that shouldn't be there. This account confirmed that the photographer had been aware of Theodore's presence during the session, and that the mysterious silhouette in the photograph was evidence that the camera had captured something that was invisible to most of the people in the room. The photographer's reaction also suggested that some people might be more sensitive to supernatural phenomena than others, and that Theodore's spirit had been strong enough to be perceived by someone who had no prior knowledge of the family's situation. Eleanor's journal also contained accounts of attempts by the family to contact Theodore's spirit through seances and other spiritualist practices that were popular during the early 1900s. These sessions had apparently been unsuccessful in helping Theodore find peace, and had instead seemed to strengthen his presence in the house. "We brought in a medium from New York," Eleanor had written in 1903. She claimed that Father's spirit was trapped by his guilt and that he could not move on until he had made amends for his crimes. But when we asked how he could make amends, the medium became frightened and refused to continue the session. The medium's reaction suggested that Theodore's spirit was not only trapped, but had become dangerous or malevolent in some way. The fact that a professional spiritualist had been frightened enough to abandon the session indicated that the supernatural presence was unusually powerful or threatening. The journal entries also described the family's growing desperation as the supernatural phenomena continued and intensified. They had tried various methods to rid themselves of Theodore's presence, including religious ceremonies, protective charms, and even attempts to physically destroy objects that seemed to be associated with the manifestations. Dr. Harrison began to understand that Theodore Ashford's spirit had been caught in a cycle of guilt and anger that had prevented him from finding peace in death. The supernatural phenomena that the family had experienced were manifestations of his desperate attempts to maintain control over his family and his legacy. The pattern of manifestations also suggested that Theodore's spirit was becoming more aggressive over time, as if his frustration and anger were growing stronger rather than fading. This progression explained why the later occupants of the mansion had experienced more serious problems than the original family members. Dr. Harrison decided to research the ultimate fate of the workers who had died in accidents at Theodore's factories, to see if there might be any way to address the injustices that had kept his spirit earthbound. He found that most of the workers who had died had left behind families who had received little or no compensation for their losses. The widows and children of these men had often been forced into poverty, with no legal recourse against the powerful Ashford family. The lack of justice for these families represented a continuing wound that might have been preventing Theodore's spirit from finding peace. The guilt over his crimes, combined with the knowledge that his victims had never received justice, could have created a spiritual prison that kept him bound to the earthly realm. The families of Theodore's victims had struggled for generations with poverty and hardship, never receiving acknowledgement of the wrongs that had been committed against them. Their descendants had grown up knowing that their ancestors had been murdered, but they had been powerless to seek justice against the wealthy and influential Ashford family. Dr. Harrison also discovered that several of the workers who had died had been involved in early labor organizing efforts, and that their deaths had effectively ended attempts to improve working conditions at the Ashford factories. The pattern suggested that Theodore had used intimidation and violence to suppress labor activism, and that innocent men had died to protect his profits. The suppression of labor organizing had had lasting effects on the working conditions at the steel mills, with dangerous practices continuing for years after Theodore's death. The workers who had died trying to improve conditions for their fellow employees had become martyrs to a cause that had been defeated by violence and corruption. Working with Patricia Ashford Williams, Dr. Harrison began to research the descendants of the workers who had died, hoping to find some way to acknowledge the injustices that had been committed and perhaps help Theodore's spirit find peace. They found that many of the workers' families had remained in the Chicago area and that some of their descendants were still living in the city. Patricia decided to reach out to these families to share what she had learned about her great-grandfather's crimes and to offer formal acknowledgement of the wrongs that had been committed. The process was emotionally difficult for Patricia, who had to confront the reality that her family's wealth had been built on the suffering of innocent people. But she felt that acknowledging the truth was necessary for both her own peace of mind and for the possibility of helping Theodore's spirit find rest. The conversations with the descendants of Theodore's victims were painful, but ultimately healing. Many of these families had preserved stories about their ancestors' deaths, and they had long suspected that the official explanations were false. The meetings between Patricia and the victims' families were emotional and cathartic, providing an opportunity for acknowledgement and healing that had been denied for more than a century. For the first time, someone from the Ashford family was admitting the truth about Theodore's crimes and expressing genuine remorse for the suffering that had been caused. Several of the descendants of Theodore's victims agreed to meet with Patricia, and these conversations led to the establishment of a memorial fund, that would provide scholarships for the children and grandchildren of industrial workers. Patricia donated a significant portion of her inheritance to the fund, viewing it as a way to make amends for her great-grandfather's crimes. The Memorial Fund was established with the specific goal of supporting education and safety training for workers in dangerous industries, ensuring that the deaths of Theodore's victims would contribute to protecting future generations of workers. The fund also supported research into industrial safety and workers' rights, carrying on the work that Theodore's victims had begun when they tried to organize for better working conditions. In this way, their deaths would finally serve a purpose, and their sacrifice would be honored. Dr. Harrison documented this process as part of his research, believing that it represented an important example of how historical injustices could be addressed even decades after they had occurred. But the question remained whether these efforts would have any effect on the supernatural phenomena that had been associated with Theodore Ashford's spirit. Dr. Harrison decided to return to the site where the Ashford mansion had once stood, to see if he could detect any lingering supernatural activity. The location was now occupied by a modern office building, but he hoped that sensitive equipment might be able to detect residual energy from the haunting. The site investigation was conducted with the help of Dr. Sterling, the parapsychologist, who brought specialized equipment designed to detect electromagnetic anomalies and temperature variations that might indicate supernatural activity. The investigation team also included several other researchers who were experienced in paranormal investigation techniques, ensuring that the results would be as accurate and objective as possible. Working with Dr. Sterling, Dr. Harrison conducted an investigation of the site using electromagnetic field detectors, digital thermometers, and other equipment that paranormal researchers used to detect supernatural activity. The investigation revealed several anomalies that suggested the presence of residual supernatural energy. Electromagnetic readings were consistently higher in the area where the mansion's dining room had been located, and temperature measurements showed unexplained cold spots that seemed to move through the space. The electromagnetic anomalies were particularly significant because they occurred in patterns that suggested intelligent activity rather than random environmental factors. The readings would spike and fade in ways that seemed to respond to the investigators' presence and questions. The temperature variations were also unusual, with cold spots appearing and disappearing in ways that couldn't be explained by air conditioning or other environmental factors. The cold spots seemed to follow specific paths through the space, as if an invisible presence was moving through the area. Most significantly, Dr. Harrison's digital cameras captured several images that showed faint shadows and silhouettes in locations where no physical objects could account for them. The shadows appeared to be similar to those found in the historical Ashford photographs, suggesting that Theodore's presence might still be detectable at the site. The photographic evidence from the site investigation showed the same characteristics that Dr. Harrison had observed in the 1902 dinner photograph: partial transparency, proper perspective and lighting, and positioning that suggested an intelligent presence rather than random photographic artifacts. But the intensity of the phenomena seemed to be much weaker than what had been documented in the early 1900s, leading Dr. Harrison to theorize that Patricia's efforts to acknowledge her family's crimes might have had some effect on her great-grandfather's spirit. The reduction in supernatural activity suggested that the acknowledgement of Theodore's crimes and the establishment of the Memorial Fund might have begun to address the unresolved guilt and injustice that had kept his spirit earthbound. The investigation results were encouraging, suggesting that the process of acknowledging historical wrongs and making amends for past crimes could have real effects on supernatural phenomena. This finding had important implications for other cases involving hauntings that might be related to unresolved injustices. Dr. Harrison's investigation of the Ashford dinner photograph had evolved into something much larger than a simple case of historical preservation. It had become an exploration of how guilt, injustice, and unresolved trauma could persist across generations, and how the acknowledgement of historical wrongs might help heal wounds that had festered for more than a century. The photograph itself had become a powerful piece of evidence documenting not just a family gathering, but a supernatural encounter that revealed the hidden crimes and guilty secrets that had shaped the Ashford family's history. The case had demonstrated that historical photographs could contain information that went far beyond their obvious visual content, serving as windows into the emotional and spiritual experiences of the people they depicted. Dr. Harrison's work on the case earned recognition from both historical preservation organizations and paranormal research groups. The enhanced photograph was featured in exhibitions about supernatural photography, and his research into the Ashford family's history contributed to broader studies of labor relations and industrial corruption in early 20th century America. The case had also established new protocols for investigating historical photographs that might contain supernatural elements, combining traditional archival research with modern digital enhancement techniques and paranormal investigation methods. But for Dr. Harrison, the most important outcome of the investigation was the knowledge that historical research could serve purposes beyond simple preservation and education. It could also help address injustices and provide closure for families who had been affected by crimes that had been hidden for generations. The Ashford dinner photograph remained in the archives of the Chicago Historical Society, but it was now accompanied by detailed documentation of the family's history and the supernatural phenomena that had been associated with Theodore Ashford's spirit. Visitors to the archives could view the photograph and read about the investigation that had revealed its secrets, learning not just about photographic techniques and historical preservation, but about the ways that guilt and injustice could persist beyond death. The exhibit that featured the Ashford photograph became one of the most popular displays at the Historical Society, attracting visitors from around the world who were interested in both the technical aspects of the investigation and the human story behind the supernatural phenomena. Dr. Harrison often reflected on the case and its implications for his work as a historical preservation specialist. He had learned that photographs could contain more than just visual information. They could also capture emotional and spiritual energy that provided insight into the lives and experiences of the people they depicted. The mysterious silhouette in the Ashford dinner photograph had been more than just a photographic anomaly. It had been a window into a family's dark secrets and a testament to the power of unresolved guilt to transcend the boundaries between life and death. Years later, Dr. Harrison would continue to work with historical photographs, but he would never forget the case of Theodore Ashford and the dinner party that had been haunted by the ghost of a man who could not find peace. The photograph served as a reminder that the past was never truly past, and that the crimes and injustices of previous generations could continue to affect the living until they were acknowledged and addressed. The creepiest detail ever found in a 1902 dinner photo had turned out to be evidence of a haunting that had persisted for decades, but it had also become a catalyst for healing and reconciliation that had helped bring peace to both the living and the dead. In the end, the Ashford dinner photograph became more than just a historical artifact. It became a testament to the power of truth to overcome deception and to the possibility of redemption even for those who had committed terrible crimes. The silhouette in the empty chair would always be there, captured forever in that moment from 1902, but now it served as a reminder that even the darkest secrets could eventually be brought to light, and that justice, though delayed, could still be served. Dr. Harrison's investigation had proven that sometimes the most important discoveries were not about what we could see clearly, but about what we almost saw, lurking just at the edge of perception, waiting for someone with the courage and persistence to bring it into the light. The mystery of the Ashford dinner photograph had been solved, but the lessons it taught about guilt, justice, and redemption would continue to resonate for generations to come. And in the archives of the Chicago Historical Society, the photograph continues to watch over visitors, a silent witness to the power of truth and the possibility that even the most tormented spirits can find peace when justice is finally served.